even when we're asking, folks, say, how are you, or, what's going on? Oh, I'm fine, right? Everyone's always fine, like Shelley said. And we're gonna talk a little bit more about avoidance in a second here. Again, I'm not gonna go through this whole thing, but this is just kind of as we've been talking about signs, symptoms, responses to trauma, secondary trauma. This is again from Charles Figley. He actually talks about PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder more as primary stress disorder versus secondary stress disorder. Basically, to kind of highlight the fact that the symptoms here is pretty much exactly the same. And so this is sort of the diagnostic criteria for PTSD here. And you can see on the other side there that essentially everything's the same except that you didn't sort of firsthand experience the event, right? You're more hearing about somebody else's traumatizing event. So, right, with avoidance, I think this is probably one of the ways that we may see, something we may see the most or pretty often with our staff, and whether that's avoiding coming into work, avoiding certain clients, paperwork, different things. And really it makes sense why people would avoid something that's distressing or painful, particularly in the short term, but really in the long run it's not a useful strategy. And so we've got another video. This one's a little more serious though, and just does a pretty good job, I think, of describing or explaining avoidance and sort of why that's helpful maybe in the short term but not the long run, and certainly better than I could, so let's watch that.
This is a story of human motivation. Humans are motivated equally in two directions. To avoid things we don't want and to move towards things we do want. And this is a jolly good idea. It's a particularly good idea for things happening in the external world. But then humans invented language, and we developed words for things, including things happening in our internal world, like thoughts and emotions. And then we applied the same rule. Being clever, we classified difficult feelings like anxiety, doubt, and uncertainty as things to move away from, and emotions like happiness, excitement, and relief as things to move towards. This makes intuitive sense. But applying the away and towards rule to our internal world leads to problems. Think about something you've done that you're really proud of, like running a marathon or passing an exam. And then think about the early days or moments when you were moving towards this achievement. What were your thoughts and emotions then? The short-term result of moving towards something we really value is usually negative thoughts and uncomfortable emotions. So our minds tell us to move away, just as if we saw a bear or a moving bus. Then, if we do move away, the first emotion that shows up is relief. So to summarize, language has encouraged us to try and move away from bad or difficult thoughts and emotions and to move towards good ones. But this is a trap, because it can mean we move away from what matters most to us in life. This is called experiential avoidance. Experiential avoidance can work in the short term, but the problem is it doesn't tend to work in the long term. If we make it a priority to avoid difficult emotions, we start to construct our lives around avoiding things we don't want rather than moving towards things we do want. So what do we do about this? In order to beat experiential avoidance, we firstly have to understand what our values really look like. What do we really want from life? Then we need to help people to build their willingness here, to experience these difficult thoughts and emotions, in order to keep moving towards here. We can't have love without fear of rejection. We can't achieve greatly without fear of failure. And we can't change our lives for the better without worrying that we will change for the worst. There is no way around this. It is the human condition.
Okay, I really like that video. I like like that it highlights that there is a small reward to avoiding initially, but what you're doing is you're sacrificing your long-term success, really. So, moving on, just some more kind of indicators of stress, secondary traumatic stress. You can load them all up. Just kind of thinking of things a little differently here. Emotional indicators, anger, sadness, physical, like we talked about, from those headaches. Personal indicators, we talked about cynicism already. These workplace ones we haven't really hit on yet, but aside from avoiding clients, but I think too, these can be difficult to tease out or always see, especially kind of this irritability of the spouse or family. We don't always hear about what's going on in personal lives, but sometimes if we're paying attention, you can kind of pick up on things like, oh, maybe it's not going so well. Yeah, I think we kind of run through these examples enough. I don't know that we need to keep hitting on them.
Okay. So we've kind of defined some of these conditions. We talked a bit about the symptoms, what it might look like. Wondering, kind of before we move on, if you guys have any questions or comments or thoughts? John, anything from you?
Thank you.
All right. So before we start talking about some ways that we can help or what we might be able to do with our staff a bit, we just kind of wanted to have a brief conversation about why this is particularly important for us as supervisors and really why we kind of started here with having this type of conversation with the supervisors. And first of all, I think generally we recognize things in others a bit easier and maybe a bit more quickly than we do in ourselves, right? I mean, we talk about avoidance, we might tend to do that, or I think sometimes we think we're pretty good at hiding things when really other people can see them. I know my wife's a lot better at that than I am, right? If I'm kind of masking some frustrations or things, generally she's pretty able to pick up on that, right? So I think just with our staff, right, as they're kind of running around, seeing clients, doing paperwork, all the things that they might need to do, you know, they just may not be as readily noticing those things or kind of bringing them up to us in supervision. And so I think as supervisors, we're in a position to be able to kind of notice and pay attention and recognize that. There's a couple of researchers out of London that do some work around workplace wellness and looking at the impact that psychological acceptance has on workplace wellness. And so, you know, they've talked about, you know, the fact that helpers who use avoidance strategies are more at risk for secondary traumatic stress. They said that people who are more willing to experience negative emotional experiences enjoy better mental health and do better at their jobs over time. But certainly in order to experience those negative emotions, we have to be present and we have to be mindful and maybe take some time and just sort of pause and reflect on sort of where we're at and what it is that we're feeling. And I think the last thing here is that as supervisors, if we're not paying attention to the impact that the work can have on us and the fact that folks may tend to avoid, we may mistake that for maybe some worker deficiency or maybe workers getting lazy or just not trying hard enough, or right, we may need to go to some progressive discipline plans or be a bit more punitive when in fact maybe there's a piece of that in there as well, but really what might be most helpful is for us to kind of help them think through what's going on and the fact that maybe they're simply avoiding a particular client or doing case notes for a particular client because of the reactions that they feel in working with that child or that family.
Which is a nice segue into our next slide. So as we kind of talk about all this, we're talking about supporting staff, and thinking about things differently, like, oh, maybe them not showing up to work because they're always sick might be related to some STS stuff. That can lead to a real tension, and I think we talk about this a little bit in our division, and I don't know that there's a right or wrong answer here, but I wanted to just have a discussion with you guys, kind of your experience of like, I have a staff that might be dealing with some real serious stuff here, and handling some trauma, but they're not getting their paperwork in, or they're not getting their units in, or whatever. What does that mean? What do I do with that? Can you guys think of instances like that, and maybe share how you've learned to deal with that, or learned to handle that?
Being able to give them a lighter workload, so they're able to kind of get things together, maybe referring them to our employment assistance
Yeah,
program.
yeah. So make adjustments where you can.
Helping them kind of prioritize the workload, because sometimes when you're in the thick of having STS stuff going on, it's hard to be, or it's very easy to be overwhelmed by a task list. And sometimes it helps with an outside person just to kind of help prioritize what comes first, what's not as high on the totem pole.
Yeah, as supervisors, we have a bit different perspective that we can utilize. An outsider perspective.
Giving space to talk about it, and lots of space.
Mm-hmm.
I think a more understanding with someone that's more collaborative on the process of just saying where they're at and really trying to work through it, as opposed to just complete avoidance.
Yeah, I think as supervisors, it's important that we, what you both are kind of saying is to provide an environment where a staff can come forward, or maybe we can identify like, hey, I think you're going through some stuff here. Being able to talk that through a little bit. And then on the other hand, going, you have some stuff to go through, but also you have some work to do. Kind of navigating that, it's real difficult, but at least if you have the space to get the conversation going, it's been really helpful. I would argue too, even if you have to move into kind of a progressive discipline plan or any kind of plan, that plan doesn't just need to be like, well, you need to have, 10 reports done by this day. It can also include, and we're gonna talk about this STS stuff, weekly as revision or something like that. Whatever that might look like, whatever staff might be comfortable with, can be really supportive as well.
I think it's a little different working in residential though, because there isn't really separation. When our staff come to work, they're right back with the kids that,
Yeah,
so it's not like you're gonna be in the
There's-
office doing paperwork, work on different, it's like, no,
Right.
here's the child right in front of you.
there's no option.
The only option is time off,
Yeah.
or I know that I've definitely done like, Julia's taking kids to the movies today, like that's her job. And just being mindful and delegating tasks that, because we do things like that with the kids, so the more fun things go to the staff that need a break, but they can't just, not be around
Right.
what caused them.
Yeah,
the
well,
issue
that's
in the
great.
first place.
You found some creative ways, some kind of wiggle room to give them some time off, as it
Yeah,
were.
even while they're like,
Yeah.
kid in the basement and watching movies, so they're still supervising, but it's downtime at work still.
That's awesome.
I find, I think sometimes staff are struggling with that because the problem looks overwhelming to them, and they don't know how to fix it, and they don't know what to do, and they feel that hopelessness, that parallel process of the hopelessness that the client or family is dealing with. And so sometimes even just helping them make very specific plans about how to work through each step of a process or solutions can help mitigate some of that stress, because I think they feel this, you know, like my job is to help people, and if I'm going into this place and I don't walk away feeling helpful, what am I doing here?
Yeah, when they're lost, giving them a roadmap is gonna be helpful. Okay.
So where do we go from here, right? What are some things that we can do, maybe to help staff? And, you know, I'm not sure that any of these are necessarily gonna be, you know, sort of groundbreaking, earth-shattering kinds of things, but I think it's just important for us. I think as Ben kind of mentioned, sometimes it's just kind of a shift in sort of how we think about or talk about some of this stuff. And so I think first of all, it's just to really normalize with our staff that this is an expected workplace hazard, right? We've talked a lot about that already. Like, this is part of the work, this is going to happen. You know, I think Sarah mentioned, like, sometimes we feel like we're supposed to be able to handle this and do this, and so I don't want to say anything, right? And so if we can start to shift that conversation and that thinking to say, no, this is part of it, and, you know, let's be open and real about that. Leslie Ann Ross is one of the co-founders of the Secondary Traumatic Stress Work Group for the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, and she talks about like this hero culture that often exists in organizations. And to be honest with you, I feel like I've sensed that here over the years that I've worked here at times, and just sort of the way that we talk about the work that we do and our ability to manage that and handle that and maybe not be impacted by it. Almost like it's sort of this badge of honor, like I've been here so long that I'm not impacted by this, or I can go and meet with all these clients and go home and I'm okay. And you know, I think the reality is that I don't know, for me, I want to be affected by what our clients are going through. I want that to mess with me. And I think it's important for our staff too, to be able to feel that and to express that and talk about that, but also for us to help them build some resiliency and some coping and being able to handle that well. I have anything else to say about that? Yeah, I don't know, any thoughts about that? Makes sense.
All right. So, no, this is me. This is totally me. I read this. So, a few more things. Obviously, we kind of talked about just a bit ago having a space to be able to talk about this. And that often is you guys taking what you've learned about the signs and symptoms and kind of bringing that back to your teams and educating them so they're aware, and so they know that this is normal and they can kind of come forward. And part of coming forward is also you guys acknowledging how some of this work has impacted you. I know when I was a supervisor, even reading through a therapist's assessment of a kid and reading about all the things that kid had been through would impact me. And I would take that back to them in supervision and say, hey, I'm reading through this. I'm like it's messing with me. How are you doing? It was a good model for them. And it always seemed to be helpful in opening the door for them to talk about what they were going through. And we could support and work through that. And again, it helps combat that kind of hero culture that Brad just talked about. We don't want to be like, well, just work through it, you'll be fine. We want to help them through it and help them talk about it. And so some specific tools we have that we're just going to run through real quick, and we'll provide you with. What I want to do is create an STS folder on the O drive, and just kind of put some resources for everyone to have access to. Have you guys seen the professional quality of life scale? This is new to some, not to others. Have you guys used this before? Yes and no. It's a nice, I mean, all these